"Are you sure that's everything my husband left behind?" I asked, and for just a second, nobody at the table looked me in the eye. That should have been my first warning. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, and 1 week after burying my husband of 46 years, I sat in a polished conference room believing the worst thing that could happen to me had already happened. I was wrong. The law office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Outside the large windows, a gray Connecticut sky hung low over the town my husband and I had called home for decades. Across from me sat my son, Daniel, and his wife, Vanessa. Daniel wore the same navy suit he had worn to the funeral. Vanessa wore a cream-colored blazer and a smile that seemed just a little too relaxed for a woman attending an estate meeting. At the head of the table sat Harold Benson, my husband's attorney and friend for nearly 30 years. A thick stack of estate documents rested neatly beside him. Harold adjusted his glasses and finished reviewing the final summary. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, the family business shares. Everything sounded orderly, predictable, final. Daniel leaned back in his chair and released a long breath. Vanessa reached for his hand under the table, thinking nobody noticed. "I noticed. Dad always believed in keeping things simple," Daniel said. "I'm glad he made everything clear." Vanessa nodded. It's what he would have wanted. There was something about the way she said it that settled heavily in my chest. Not enough to alarm me, just enough to make me uncomfortable. Harold remained unusually quiet. That was strange. Normally, he explained every detail twice. Today, he seemed distracted, almost cautious. As the meeting continued, Vanessa began talking about practical matters. Renovations, property management, tax strategies, future plans for the lakefront property my husband had loved. She spoke as though decisions had already been made, as though ownership had already changed hands. Daniel listened and agreed with almost everything she said. Neither of them asked what I wanted. Neither of them asked whether I planned to stay in the family home. I sat there silently, folding and unfolding my reading glasses in my lap. For 46 years, my husband and I had built a life together. Now everyone around me seemed eager to discuss what came next without him. Harold finally closed the folder. "That concludes the primary estate review," he said. Daniel smiled. Vanessa's shoulders visibly relaxed. The meeting appeared finished. Then something happened that I still think about to this day. Harold's eyes moved toward a large sealed envelope resting apart from the other documents. He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. Not long enough for Daniel to notice. Not long enough for Vanessa to notice. But long enough for me. I followed his gaze. "Harold," I said quietly, "is something wrong?" He looked up immediately. "No, Margaret." His answer came too fast. The room fell silent. I glanced once more toward the envelope. It was thick, unopened, separate from everything else. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly felt as though the meeting wasn't really over. As though the story everyone believed had already ended was only beginning. And while my family celebrated what they thought they had inherited, there was one page of my husband's estate documents that nobody seemed interested in reading. That evening, I returned to the house I had shared with my husband, Charles, for nearly half a century. The late autumn air felt colder than it had that morning. Dry leaves drifted across the front walkway, gathering near the stone steps he used to sweep every Saturday before breakfast. I stood there for a moment with my keys in my hand, looking at the familiar white shutters and the porch light that automatically turned on as dusk settled over the neighborhood. For years, that light had meant home. Now it felt like a question. Inside, the silence greeted me immediately. No television, no footsteps, no gentle voice asking how my day had gone. I hung my coat in the hallway closet and noticed something strange. Several file folders that Charles normally kept on the lower shelf were gone. The space where they had sat for years looked unusually empty. Perhaps Harold had collected them during the estate process, I told myself. Yet something about it stayed with me. I walked into the kitchen and set a kettle on the stove. The routine calmed me. Charles always said that important thoughts arrived more clearly over a cup of tea. As the water heated, I found myself thinking about Vanessa. During the meeting, she had not seemed sad. Relieved, perhaps. Excited, certainly. But not sad. I remembered the way she had immediately begun discussing renovations and future plans. Not once had she mentioned preserving anything Charles cared about. Not his study. Not his workshop. Not even the small lakeside cabin where he spent every summer teaching our grandchildren how to fish. The kettle whistled. I poured the tea and carried it into the den. Family photographs covered the shelves. Vacations, graduations, Christmas mornings, decades of memories frozen behind glass. I picked up one frame from 8 years earlier. Daniel stood beside Charles at the cabin dock, both of them smiling beneath matching baseball caps. Back then, my son still called every Sunday. Back then, family gatherings felt effortless. Somewhere along the way, things had changed so gradually that I almost missed it happening. My phone rang. Harold's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. His voice sounded careful. "Margaret, I wanted to check on you." "That is kind of you," I said. "But I have a feeling that is not the only reason you called." A brief silence followed. "You always were perceptive." I waited. "There are a few administrative matters we still need to review," he said. "Nothing urgent. I simply think it would be wise for you to come by the office tomorrow afternoon." "Does this have something to do with the envelope?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Tomorrow, Margaret." Before ending the call, he added something that unsettled me even more. "Bring any documents Charles may have left in his study. Anything personal, especially sealed correspondence." After we hung up, I sat motionless in the quiet room. Sealed correspondence. Charles had always been organized. Careful. Deliberate. If he had left something behind, there was a reason. I finished my tea and slowly made my way upstairs toward his study. The door stood partially open. The room looked exactly as he had left it. His reading chair, his desk lamp, his notebooks stacked with perfect precision. Yet as I stepped inside, I noticed one drawer was slightly open. And tucked inside, just barely visible beneath a leather portfolio, was a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Charles's unmistakable handwriting. I stood beside Charles's desk for a long moment before touching the envelope. My name was written across the front in blue ink, the same careful handwriting that had filled birthday cards, anniversary notes, and grocery lists for nearly 5 decades. Seeing it there made my throat tighten. Slowly, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was dated 3 months before his passing. "Margaret, if you are reading this, there is something important I need you to remember." Those were the first words. I sat down in his chair and continued reading. Charles wrote about ordinary things at first. The garden, the grandchildren, the lakefront cabin. Then the tone changed. He explained that over the previous year he had become concerned about certain conversations regarding the estate. He never mentioned anyone by name, but I immediately knew who he meant. He wrote that people often revealed their true character when money entered the room. He asked me not to make assumptions and not to confront anyone without evidence. Most importantly, he reminded me that every document should be reviewed completely before any decisions were made. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. Every document should be reviewed completely. A strange feeling settled over me. Charles was not a man who repeated himself without reason. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Then I opened the desk drawer farther. Inside were several folders arranged in neat stacks. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary, but after a few minutes I noticed gaps between certain files, as though something had been removed. The next morning I barely slept. By noon I drove to Harold's office carrying the envelope and several documents I had found in the study. Harold greeted me personally in the lobby. He looked tired, more tired than he had during the estate meeting. Once we were seated behind closed doors, I handed him the letter. He read it silently. When he finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "This sounds exactly like Charles," he said quietly. "He always planned 3 steps ahead." "Harold," I said, "what is happening?" He leaned back in his chair. "Before I answer that, I need to ask you something. Has anyone requested access to Charles's files since his passing?" I immediately thought of Vanessa. 2 days after the funeral, she had volunteered to organize paperwork in the study. At the time it seemed thoughtful. Now it felt different. "Possibly," I answered carefully. Harold nodded as though he expected that response. He opened a drawer and removed a copy of the estate inventory. Several pages were highlighted with yellow tabs. "Margaret, when I prepared the final estate package, every section was accounted for." He turned a few pages. "Every section." My pulse quickened. "And now?" He hesitated. "Now there appears to be a discrepancy." The room suddenly felt very quiet. Harold slid the inventory across the desk toward me. One line had been circled in red ink. Estate Appendix C, supporting documentation. Attached final page. I looked up. "What does that mean?" Harold's expression hardened. It means there was supposed to be one additional page included with the final documents. And where is it? Harold held my gaze for several seconds before answering. That is exactly what I am trying to find out. On the drive home, I could not stop thinking about the missing page. Connecticut's winding roads blurred past my windshield while pieces of the past slowly began fitting together in ways I had not expected. Charles had always trusted people, but he was never careless. If he had attached an additional page to the estate documents, it was there for a reason. More importantly, if it was now missing, that was not an accident. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the late afternoon sun had settled low behind the trees. The house looked exactly as it had the day before, yet everything felt different. For the first time since Charles passed away, I stopped looking at our life through the lens of grief and started looking at it through the lens of questions. I walked into the study and sat behind his desk. Slowly, I began opening drawers and reviewing old calendars, notes, and correspondence. At first, nothing stood out. Then I found one of Charles's appointment books from the previous year. Several entries had been marked in blue ink. Meetings with Harold, financial reviews, trust discussions. One note caught my attention. Review final trustee provisions before signing. The entry was dated 6 months before his passing. I stared at the words. Trustee provisions. That sounded far more important than property transfers or account balances. My phone buzzed. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated before answering. Margaret, she said cheerfully. I just wanted to see how you were doing. Her voice sounded warm. Almost too warm. I am managing, I replied. Thank you for asking. Daniel and I were discussing the lake property, she continued. There are some opportunities we should probably move on quickly before the market changes. I looked down at the appointment book in front of me. That seems rather soon. A brief silence followed. Well, we all know Charles wanted things handled efficiently. There it was again. Everyone seemed remarkably certain about what Charles wanted. Perhaps, I said carefully. Although I think there may still be some things left to review. Another pause. This one longer. What do you mean? She asked. Nothing specific. Just paperwork. Her tone changed almost instantly. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. Well, she said, if you find anything important, let us know. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. The conversation lingered in my mind. Vanessa had not asked about my health. She had not asked how I was coping. She had not even asked about the family. She had called about property. The realization left a bitter taste in my mouth. Later that evening, I opened a storage box tucked away in the back of Charles's closet. Inside were dozens of neatly labeled folders. Insurance records, tax returns, investment statements. At the very bottom sat a small leather binder. As I opened it, a folded yellow note slipped onto the floor. I picked it up and unfolded it carefully. Written in Charles's handwriting were 8 simple words. If anything seems missing, check the trust records first. The next morning, I called Harold before I could talk myself out of it. When I mentioned the note from Charles, the line went quiet for several seconds. Margaret, he finally said, I think it is time you came back to the office. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him again. This time there were no estate binders spread across the conference table. Instead, Harold carried in a narrow gray file box that looked older than everything else in the room. He placed it carefully between us. What is that? I asked. The Whitmore family trust records, he replied. My pulse quickened. Harold opened the box and removed several folders. Most contained routine legal documents, amendments, annual reviews, trustee updates. Then he stopped and frowned. That is strange. What? I asked. He flipped through the folders again. Slower this time. There should be a certification document attached to this section. He checked another folder. Then another. It is not here. The uneasy feeling returned immediately. Another missing document. Harold looked directly at me. Possibly. He stood and walked toward a locked cabinet along the wall. After entering a code, he retrieved a second file. Fortunately, I keep duplicate archives. We spent the next hour comparing records page by page. The differences were subtle, easy to overlook. A missing attachment here, a missing notation there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would alarm someone conducting a quick review. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. Certain references appeared in the archived copies, but not in the estate package recently reviewed by Daniel and Vanessa. How could this happen? I asked. Harold folded his hands. There are only a few possibilities. Administrative error. misfiling, or someone intentionally removed documents after Charles passed away. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The answer seemed obvious, yet neither of us wanted to say it aloud. As I prepared to leave, Harold handed me photocopies of several trust records. "Review these carefully," he said, "especially the sections discussing trustee authority." On the drive home, my thoughts drifted back over the past year. Little moments that had seemed harmless at the time suddenly felt different. Vanessa volunteering to organize Charles's paperwork. Vanessa offering to collect the mail while we traveled. Vanessa insisting she could help manage financial correspondence when Charles's health began declining. None of it had seemed suspicious then. In fact, I had appreciated the help. But now I wondered how much access she had actually gained. That evening, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He carried a bakery box containing my favorite blueberry muffins. The gesture should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt rehearsed. We sat in the kitchen while the coffee brewed. He spoke about work, the weather, the grandchildren, anything except the estate. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Vanessa mentioned you seemed concerned about some paperwork." I looked at him carefully. "Did she?" "She is worried you might be stressing yourself unnecessarily." The words sounded familiar. Too familiar. Like they had been given to him beforehand. I smiled politely. "I appreciate her concern." Daniel relaxed slightly. "Good. Because everything has already been settled." I thought about the missing trust documents, the missing attachments, the missing page. Then I thought about Charles's final note. If anything seems missing, check the trust records first. For the first time, I began to suspect that my husband had not merely anticipated confusion. He had anticipated exactly who would create it. Over the next several days, I stopped sharing what I was learning. That decision turned out to be one of the most important choices I made. The less I said, the more comfortable everyone else became. Daniel called twice to discuss maintenance costs for the lake property. Vanessa sent friendly text messages asking whether I needed groceries or help around the house. On the surface, their concerns seemed thoughtful. Yet every conversation somehow drifted back to assets, property, or paperwork. Never memories. Never grief. Never Charles. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Harold called with an update. His voice carried a level of excitement I had not heard since this began. "I found something," he said. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from him once again. This time he slid a thin folder across the table. "The archived trust records contain references to an internal certification review," he explained. "The review mentions a supplemental authorization page attached to the final estate package." I immediately thought of the missing page. "Can we recover it?" I asked. Harold nodded slowly. "Possibly. The original may still exist in secure storage. But there is something else you should see first." He opened the folder and pointed to several dated entries. Every review had been documented. Every access request had been recorded. My eyes moved down the page until one name appeared repeatedly. Vanessa Whitmore. I felt my stomach tighten. She requested access? Harold nodded. Several times over the last year. I continued reading. The dates aligned perfectly with periods when Charles's health had begun declining. More requests followed in the months before his passing. Requests for document summaries, asset reviews, trust explanations. None of it was illegal. None of it violated policy. Yet seeing the pattern laid out on paper changed everything. This had not been casual curiosity. It had been sustained interest. As I left the office, memories resurfaced one after another. Vanessa volunteering to organize filing cabinets. Vanessa asking detailed questions during holiday dinners. Vanessa insisting that complicated legal matters confused most older people. At the time, I thought she was being helpful. Now I wondered whether she had been studying the estate for years. That evening, I received an invitation to dinner at Daniel and Vanessa's home. Normally, I would have declined. This time I accepted immediately. Their house was brightly lit when I arrived. The grandchildren greeted me warmly. Dinner smelled wonderful. Anyone looking in from the outside would have seen a happy family gathering. Yet beneath the smiles, something felt different. Vanessa seemed unusually cheerful. Daniel appeared relaxed, almost relieved. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said. Everyone echoed the toast. Everyone except me. I smiled politely and took a sip of water. Then I noticed something sitting on a nearby side table. It was a real estate brochure featuring the lake property. Several pages had been folded and highlighted. Apparently, plans were already moving forward. They believed everything had been settled. They believed every important document had already been reviewed. Watching them celebrate, I finally understood what Charles had been trying to tell me. The missing page was not the mystery anymore. The real mystery was why certain people seemed so confident that nobody would ever find it. 3 days later, Harold called before sunrise. The urgency in his voice told me everything before he spoke. "We found it," he said. For a moment, I simply stood in my kitchen staring out the window at the pale morning light spreading across the backyard. "The page?" I asked. "The original certified copy," Harold replied. "And Margaret, it is exactly where Charles intended it to be." By noon I was back at the law office. Harold closed the conference room door behind us and placed a sealed archival sleeve on the table. Unlike the photocopies we had reviewed, this document carried original signatures, certification stamps, and witness acknowledgments. Nothing about it looked accidental. Nothing about it looked unimportant. My hands trembled slightly as I watched Harold remove the page. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. The language was formal, precise, and unmistakably written to prevent misunderstanding. Several paragraphs discussed trustee responsibilities. Others described conditions related to asset management. Then Harold stopped and looked up at me. Charles was very thorough. I could hear it in his voice. Whatever he had just read mattered. He continued. The page did not transfer additional property. It did not create new beneficiaries. Instead, it established a final oversight provision connected to the family trust. Under specific circumstances, the acting trustee retained authority to evaluate whether the intended heirs were fulfilling certain family obligations before receiving full control of trust assets. I listened carefully. Something about the wording sounded familiar. "Who was the trustee?" I asked quietly. Harold slid the page across the table. My eyes moved directly to the signature line. "Charles Whitmore." Then beneath it, another name. "Margaret Whitmore." I stared at the page. "Me?" Harold nodded. "You were named successor trustee several years ago." The room seemed unusually still. "Daniel does not know this." Harold shook his head. "Not from what I have seen." A strange mix of emotions washed over me. Confusion, relief, sadness. Charles had trusted me with far more responsibility than I realized. Suddenly, dozens of memories made sense. The financial discussions he insisted I attend. The trust reviews he encouraged me to learn about. The notes he left behind. He had been preparing me, not for widowhood, for this. That evening, Daniel called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. He explained that Vanessa had already scheduled preliminary meetings regarding future property decisions. Potential buyers had expressed interest in the lake house. Contractors wanted to evaluate renovation possibilities. Everyone seemed eager to move forward. I listened quietly. The confidence in his voice was almost painful to hear. He genuinely believed everything was settled. When the call ended, I sat alone in Charles's study. The certified page rested beside his old reading lamp. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the truth was finally beginning to emerge. Yet one question continued to trouble me. If this page existed, and if it changed the entire structure of authority surrounding the trust, then someone had a powerful reason for wanting it overlooked. And for the first time since Charles passed away, I no longer wondered whether that omission had been intentional. I was beginning to wonder how many other decisions had been made based on the assumption that I would never discover the truth. The following week unfolded exactly as Harold predicted. The more confident Daniel and Vanessa became, the more information they revealed without realizing it. I did not argue. I did not challenge their assumptions. Instead, I listened. One afternoon, Vanessa invited me to lunch at a waterfront restaurant overlooking the harbor. The invitation surprised me. During the entire meal, she spoke enthusiastically about the future. New opportunities, new investments, new possibilities for the family assets. Every sentence carried the same underlying message. The decisions had already been made. At one point, she unfolded several pages from a leather portfolio and casually slid them across the table. "Nothing official yet," she said with a smile. "Just preliminary projections." I glanced down. The documents outlined estimated proceeds from the future sale of the lake property, estimated renovation budgets, potential investment allocations. The numbers were impressive. What caught my attention was not the money. It was the assumption. Every projection treated the assets as though they were already under Daniel's complete control. Vanessa watched my reaction carefully. Charles always wanted the family to move forward, she said. Holding on to things because of sentiment is not always practical. I looked out across the water before answering. Sometimes people leave things behind for reasons other than money. Her smile tightened slightly. Of course. Yet her expression suggested she disagreed completely. A few days later, Daniel called with more news. He sounded excited. Several interested buyers had requested private tours of the lake property. A real estate consultant had prepared valuation reports. Contractors were discussing modernization options. Everything seemed to be accelerating. "We are finally making progress," he said. Progress. The word lingered in my mind long after the call ended. That evening, Harold and I met again. He reviewed the latest developments without visible surprise. "Exactly as expected," he said. "People tend to move very quickly when they believe there are no obstacles left." He opened a folder containing updated trust records and meeting notes. Several new pages had been added. "Margaret, I need you to understand something important. The oversight provision was designed specifically for situations like this." I listened carefully. Harold explained that the trust was never intended to function as a simple transfer of wealth. Charles had structured it around stewardship, responsibility, and family obligations. Ownership and authority were not automatically the same thing. One could inherit assets without earning control over them. Suddenly, the entire estate plan made sense. Charles had anticipated future conflicts long before any of us recognized them. As the meeting ended, Harold informed me that a formal trust review conference would take place within 2 weeks. Everyone involved would be present. Supporting records would be reviewed. Final certifications would be confirmed. Nothing in his tone sounded dramatic. Yet I understood exactly what he was saying. The assumptions guiding every recent decision were about to face scrutiny. That night, I returned home and sat alone in Charles's study. The certified page rested safely inside a locked drawer. Outside, winter winds rattled the bare tree branches against the dark sky. Inside, the house felt strangely peaceful. For the first time since Charles passed away, I no longer felt lost. I felt prepared. Because while my family continued celebrating plans built upon certainty, a meeting was approaching that would force everyone to confront something they had completely overlooked. Not a property, not an account, not a signature, a condition. The days leading up to the trust review conference felt strangely calm. That was what unsettled me most. Daniel and Vanessa were no longer cautious. They were confident. Every conversation reflected it. Every plan assumed the same outcome. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by the house carrying a folder filled with documents. He spread them across the dining room table while speaking enthusiastically about timelines and future opportunities. Market forecasts, investment strategies, property transfers. He sounded more like a business executive presenting a proposal than a son discussing a family legacy. I listened quietly while he explained everything. At one point he smiled and said, "Dad spent years building all of this. The best thing we can do is keep moving forward." I nodded. "And if something changes?" His expression never wavered. "Nothing is going to change." The certainty in his voice was almost heartbreaking. Not because he sounded malicious, because he sounded completely convinced. After he left, I gathered the papers he had shown me. Several pages contained handwritten notes. One phrase appeared repeatedly beside different assets. "Ready for transfer." The word stayed with me. Ready for transfer. As though every decision had already been approved. As though no further review was necessary. The following morning, Harold called to finalize preparations for the conference. The meeting would include legal representatives, trust administrators, and all primary beneficiaries. Every supporting document would be entered into the official record. Every certification would be verified. Harold's tone remained professional, but I could sense something beneath it. Anticipation. Not because he expected conflict. Because he expected clarity. Later that evening, Vanessa invited me to another family dinner. The atmosphere felt almost celebratory. The grandchildren laughed in the living room. Music played softly from a speaker in the kitchen. A bottle of sparkling cider sat chilling in a silver bucket near the counter. It felt less like a family meal and more like the beginning of a victory party. During dessert, Vanessa raised a question that immediately caught my attention. "Margaret, have you decided what you want to do after everything is finalized?" I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Travel. Downsizing. Maybe relocating closer to family." Her smile remained pleasant. "A fresh start." Daniel nodded in agreement. "You deserve to enjoy yourself." I smiled politely. Yet beneath their words I heard something else. Assumptions. Expectations. Plans being made without me. When I returned home that night, I walked into Charles's study and sat in silence. The room looked exactly as it always had. The same shelves, the same desk, the same reading lamp casting a warm circle of light across the wood surface. I opened the drawer containing the certified document and placed it in front of me. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Not because of what it contained, because of what it represented. Charles had not built his estate around wealth. He had built it around responsibility, around trust, around character. Outside, snow began falling softly across the dark yard. Inside, the house felt peaceful. Across town, my family was preparing for what they believed would be a final confirmation of their plans. Meanwhile, the conference was only days away, and sitting quietly inside a locked drawer was a document capable of changing every assumption they had made. The morning of the trust review conference arrived with a thin layer of snow covering the sidewalks and rooftops across town. I woke before dawn and sat quietly in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching the first light appear beyond the trees. Strangely, I felt calm. For weeks I had lived with questions. Now, for the first time, answers were finally within reach. By 10 o'clock, everyone had gathered in the main conference room at Harold's office. Daniel arrived first, carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. Vanessa followed a few minutes later, dressed with the same polished confidence she had displayed ever since the original estate meeting. Several trust administrators were already seated at the table reviewing files. The atmosphere felt professional, almost routine. That seemed to reassure Daniel and Vanessa. They exchanged relaxed smiles and settled comfortably into their seats. Harold entered precisely on time. He greeted everyone politely before taking his place at the head of the table. For the first 30 minutes, the meeting proceeded exactly as expected. Asset inventories were reviewed. Property records were confirmed. Financial summaries were entered into the official record. Everything appeared straightforward. Daniel answered questions confidently. Vanessa occasionally added comments regarding future planning. Several times I noticed her glance toward me. Each time I responded with the same calm expression. Eventually, Harold closed one folder and opened another. The room grew noticeably quieter. Before final certification can occur, he said, there is one remaining matter that requires review. Daniel looked mildly surprised. I thought everything had already been addressed. Almost everything, Harold replied. He reached into a document case beside his chair and removed a sealed archival sleeve. The moment I saw it, I recognized it immediately. My pulse quickened. Across the table, Vanessa's smile faded ever so slightly. Harold carefully removed the certified page and placed it in front of him. Nobody spoke. Even the trust administrators seemed curious. For the first time all morning, nobody discussed properties, investments, or future sales. The conversation centered entirely on authority, oversight, and trustee responsibilities. Daniel leaned forward. I do not understand, he said. Why was this not included in the original review? Nobody answered immediately. Harold simply continued documenting the certification history and chain of custody records associated with the page. Each fact added another layer of silence to the room. Vanessa lowered her eyes toward the table. It was the first time I had seen uncertainty replace confidence. As the final certification notes were entered into the record, one thing became unmistakably clear. The assumptions guiding every decision over the past several weeks had been built upon an incomplete understanding of the trust. And now, sitting in full view of everyone present, was the document that changed everything. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced since Charles passed away. Nobody spoke for several moments. The trust administrators reviewed the certified page carefully, comparing it against the records already entered into the file. Harold remained calm, methodical, patient. He answered every question with supporting documentation. Every certification matched. Every signature was verified. Every procedural requirement had been satisfied years earlier. There was no confusion. There was only a truth that had finally been placed on the table. Daniel looked from Harold to me and back again. Are you saying my mother has authority over the trust? He asked. Harold folded his hands. I am saying that Charles established a successor trustee structure. Under the conditions outlined in the certified document, Margaret retains evaluation authority regarding compliance with the family stewardship provisions before final control transfers can occur. The room fell silent again. Daniel blinked several times as though trying to process what he had just heard. Vanessa remained motionless. Her expression was carefully controlled, but I could see the tension in her posture. One of the administrators cleared his throat. The document is valid. The language is explicit. The oversight provision remains active. Hearing those words spoken by an independent reviewer changed everything. This was no longer a disagreement between family members. It was an official finding supported by the trust itself. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Why did Dad never tell me? His voice sounded smaller than before. Not angry. Hurt. Harold answered gently. Charles believed responsibility revealed character. He preferred actions over promises. I lowered my eyes toward the polished conference table. That sounded exactly like my husband. For years he had judged people not by what they said, but by what they consistently did. Another administrator reviewed several notes before asking a final question. Has the successor trustee completed an evaluation regarding the stewardship provisions? Every eye in the room turned toward me. For the first time that morning, I was no longer simply observing events. I was part of them. I took a slow breath before answering. Not yet. Vanessa looked up immediately. It was a small reaction, but impossible to miss. Hope flickered across her face. Harold made a note in the record. Then the review remains pending. The words changed the atmosphere instantly. Plans that had seemed certain were suddenly suspended. Timelines became uncertain. Assumptions became questions. Future decisions would require examination rather than expectation. As the meeting concluded, the administrators gathered their files and prepared official summaries. Nobody celebrated. Nobody argued. Everyone simply absorbed the reality of what had been established. Daniel approached me near the doorway. For a moment, he looked like the young boy who used to sit beside Charles at the lake cabin asking endless questions about fishing and life. Mom, he said quietly, did you know about this? I looked at him honestly. Not until recently. He nodded slowly. Across the room, Vanessa stood alone reviewing papers that no longer seemed to provide the certainty they once had. For the first time since this process began, I saw something replace confidence in her eyes. Concern. Because the conversation was no longer about what had been inherited. It was about whether the people receiving that inheritance had truly honored the responsibility that came with it. The formal evaluation process took several weeks. During that time, I reviewed records, correspondence, meeting notes, and recommendations with Harold and the trust administrators. I did not rush. Charles never rushed important decisions, and neither would I. What surprised me most was not what I discovered in the documents. It was what I discovered in people. Once the certainty of immediate control disappeared, attitudes began to change. Conversations that had once revolved around assets slowly shifted toward accountability. Daniel visited more often. At first, I assumed he wanted updates. Instead, he asked questions about his father. Stories he had never taken time to hear. Memories from years before career pressures and financial ambitions consumed so much of his attention. One afternoon, we spent nearly 3 hours at the kitchen table looking through old family photographs. For the first time in a very long while, he seemed less interested in inheritance and more interested in understanding the man who created it. Vanessa was different. She remained polite, but distant. The confidence that had carried her through the earlier meetings never fully returned. Eventually, during one final review session, she admitted something important. She had become so focused on managing outcomes that she stopped considering the responsibilities attached to them. It was not a dramatic confession. It was a quiet acknowledgement. Sometimes those are more meaningful. By early spring, the evaluation was complete. The trust administrators issued their findings. The family trust would remain intact. The lake property would not be sold. Several proposed transfers would be postponed. Future authority would be shared through a structure designed to protect the long-term interests of the family rather than the short-term interests of any individual. Nobody lost everything. Nobody gained everything. Instead, the system Charles built worked exactly as he intended. It rewarded stewardship rather than entitlement. After the final meeting, I drove alone to the lake cabin. The snow had melted. Small patches of green were beginning to appear along the shoreline. The water reflected the afternoon sun exactly the way I remembered from years ago. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Nothing had changed. The old fishing rods still rested in the corner. The photographs still lined the mantel. Charles's favorite chair still faced the lake. I sat there quietly for a long time, not grieving, not celebrating, simply reflecting. In the end, the most valuable thing my husband left behind was not property, money, or investments. It was a test of character, a reminder that family is measured by responsibility, not possession. As I watched the sunlight dance across the water, I thought about the page that nearly disappeared, the page everyone overlooked, the page that changed everything. Then I smiled, because Charles had understood something long before the rest of us did. Wealth can be inherited, authority can be assigned, but character must be revealed, and eventually, it always is.